Hello everybody, thank you all for coming. It really means a lot to me that you are here today and to everyone here. My name is Shelby Mushler and I'm a peer writing tutor at the University Center for Writing-Based Learning, or the UCWbL, which is where you all are now, and a head writing fellow for the Writing Fellows program. This event is particularly special to me. It's an idea I proposed in July and have been working on the past several months with a brilliant team. I absolutely love the UCWbL because of our beliefs about writing and emphasis on community. In an effort to share that love with others, I thought it would be a pretty cool idea to have the space open to everyone for at least one night where people can just talk about writing. Thankfully, I had support and people believed in me, especially Jen and Matthew and Aaron, for helping so extensively with the planning of this event. So here we are today. Panelists, thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate your presence and dedication to writing, and we're extremely eager to hear about your experiences as writers. We welcome Dr. Brad Hoot, an assistant professor, an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages. He conducts research in linguistics and has written numerous journal articles and book chapters, including some collaborative projects. Most recently, his article, The Acquisition of Information Focus in L2 Spanish, was published in the journal Second Language Research. We also have Dr. Jason Schneider. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Discourse, as well as the coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in TESOL. His research draws on both rhetorical studies and applied linguistics, and he has written journal articles, book chapters, and book reviews. His most recent publication, Passages into College Writing, Listening to the Experiences of International Students, appeared in Composition Forum. Additionally, we'll hear from Dr. Fanny Söderbäck. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and co-founder and co-director of the Kristeva Circle. Her research specializes in feminist philosophy as well as 20th century continental philosophy. She has worked on many publications, including journal articles, book chapters, and approximately 100 articles as a freelancing art and literary critic. Dr. Söderbäck's monograph, Revolutionary Time on Time and Difference in Kristeva and Irigare, is forthcoming later this year. So panelists, thank you all so much for being here. Tonight's conversation will be facilitated by Matthew Pearson. He's the UCWbL's acting director and manager of our professional and student staff. In his permanent role as the online teaching and learning director, he promotes and supports writing as a way to improve learning and teaching. His past scholarship addressed how English language learners benefit from explicit instruction on the cognitive strategies that effective writers and readers use, and his current research is focused on design and its pedagogical uses. So without further ado, here's Matthew to take it away.
Thanks everybody for coming, we really appreciate it. Just a sort of simple question to start us off. Why do you think that writing matters?
Wow, I wasn't asked to prepare for that question. Well, I mean, it matters because it's a way of communicating to people beyond just whoever is in the room with you. And so it's a way of sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, building upon discourse of other people and engaging in conversation in a way that makes possible global conversation, national conversation, multidisciplinary conversation. So yeah, sharing ideas happens through writing, by and large.
Yeah, and maybe I would add to that, so the sharing part, but also the performing ourselves part, sort of somehow our identities, whatever those are, whatever we believe we are, come out through our writing, whether that's writing in a journal or writing an essay or writing an academic paper or writing a lot of things you have to write in classes. It's you expressing you in whatever kind of ways are available to you there.
I mean, and from my perspective, or from a slightly different perspective, writing is sort of the fossil record of science. So like that's sort of what makes science real, is when it's written. I mean, you see stuff at conference presentations where you can learn something, but it's sort of real when the journal article comes out. And so that's sort of like the record. That's when it's official, in a way. So, and that's then sort of the permanent record of scientific progress.
So maybe if you want to keep going, Bradley, if you don't mind, sort of general question, but how have you used writing in your professional work? So obviously publishing things, but that and anything else. How do you use it in your professional work? What kinds of things do you write?
Sure. So almost all of my professional writing is scientific journal articles. So I do an experiment, and then I write a description of the experiment and its theoretical implications. So that's the primary sort of formal writing that I do. It's a kind of writing that has a sort of very specific genre and a very specific style to it. So that's the main way that I use. I mean, each of those articles advances my work. But there is, I think, something I was thinking about, because you did ask us to prepare this question ahead of time. Is my mic going in and out? I think it might be. All right. This something I was thinking about is it's not just the preparation of the article in terms of creating that record that is useful for my work. It's the act of preparing the article that is useful for my work. It's the thinking, having to think through the problems and having to sit down and say, well, what is the implication of this? No, I can't have like a vague sort of general understanding of like this would be neat to study. I have to be able to say explicitly what it is. So it also advances my own thinking process. So I use it that way as well. And I do that not only with my professional articles, but also in an informal way. I often will write to myself to try to figure out a problem, rather than just sitting there. I think that people have this image that this is what professors do all day, is we sit in our offices and stroke our beards that we're supposed to have. And then you like just ponder, and then brilliant things come out on the page that you don't have to revise. But in point of fact, I do a lot of what I've heard called writing to think, or writing as thinking, right? As opposed to thinking and then just writing down my perfectly formed thoughts. I do a lot of writing as thinking, and I do that sometimes informally as well, just for myself, just to plan out my quarter, plan out this project, or just try to get a sense of what I'm thinking about something.
How about you, Jason?
So yeah, there's the writing, like the research writing, and Shelby mentioned different things we publish. There's all that writing that becomes something visible. But then there's thinking about what do you do in professional life with writing? Fanny and I were talking about before. There's a lot of writing that we do, which ends up being sort of writing about writing. So for example, if you're going to, you want to present your work at a conference, well, you have to write a proposal about the things that you wrote about or want to talk about in order to do that. There's writing, you want to get a grant, well, you have to write about the thing you want to write about in order to maybe get some grant money to support that research. We've all been talking about sort of tenure process. There's different reviews you have to go through. You have to write about the writing you've done, which is your research, and to present it in an institutional context. So there's a lot of that sort of behind the scenes writing that goes into working as a scholar and a professor. And I would also add on to that all the writing we do, which is connected to teaching. So I feel like I do write a lot of emails. Some of you have received those, but also write a syllabus. I mean, that's writing, sort of putting together the syllabus. I really think about those words. How do we describe this assignment? How do we want to put this together? So that's all also professional writing that probably in the end takes up more actual hours and minutes than the writing the draft that may become a research article.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So my life as a professional writer has sort of gone through different phases. So I'm from Sweden originally, and I got my master's in comparative literature in Sweden. And as a part of that master's, which was a master's in comparative literature with a gender perspective, was also built in a full year of creative writing. So that's kind of where I started. Fun writing, creative writing. Although it became clear throughout that year that as much as I enjoyed it, that was probably not what I should do professionally. I didn't feel like I was great at it. And so I actually took a break from academia and I went to journalism school in Sweden. And then I spent a couple of years freelancing as a art, film, and literary critic. And so then most of my writing were reviews, debate articles, sort of brief interjections into contemporary issues, so not academic writing. And then once I ended up doing a PhD in philosophy, I guess is when I started doing the kind of scholarly writing. Although I would say that's the one part that I never got any formal training in. Nobody ever really taught me how to do that. I kind of figured it out as I went. But as it turned out, that was the kind of writing that I also felt the most at home in, and so I kind of stuck with that. But I would concur that as much as that's what I see myself as doing, the scholarly writing is actually a very, very small part of my writing. Most of my writing is text messages with colleagues, emails with students, the meta writing that you were talking about, writing about my writing, or writing about how I should receive the money to get the writing I want to do done. And so the real nitty-gritty writing of scholarly articles or books usually happens for 1 month in the summer, or late nights after my kid is asleep, or kind of in the in-betweens when suddenly there's actually time for me in my writing. As much as I think of it as a central part of what I do professionally.
Have you experienced generating ideas or parts of ideas? I mean, you were kind of hinting at this. Have you experienced that coming through those text messages or those emails, where that you're working through an idea that then shows up in your summertime writing when you have time to like really explore it?
Sure, sometimes, absolutely, yeah.
Certainly, I mean, I've done several of my publishing projects have been collaborative, because, when you're running a study, it can be helpful to have a group of people running that study. And so actually I didn't think about it until now, but email does play a really sort of important role, because I'll sometimes write an email to a collaborator that says, here's what I think this section should say, right? And that will end up being the outline for this section. I mean, just today, I wrote to one of the collaborators on a project I'm working on right now, this is what I think the 2 main research questions of this paper are, right? And then she wrote back and said, actually, I think it's not 3, it's 2, this is how we should format it, right? And so we're doing some of the writing that will end up forming that project via email. So yeah, absolutely, that happens.
I might add one more in there, that kind of writing. So I do projects that involve collecting data and often interviews. So I have a project I'm working on now for 4 years. And I've got literally hundreds of pages of interview transcripts from that. And some of the writing I've been doing the last few months is reading those transcripts and making notes about what I have there and coding the data. And that's all writing. And from that writing is where I start to think, oh, there's something I never thought about before, and starting to sort of come out in the way I'm thinking about what I'm writing about, these transcripts I have.
Okay, so thinking about the formal pieces that you write for professional reasons, for professional, accolades and tenure, and that you get credit for as a professor. So put it in the context of one of my favorite people who heard me talk about writing know that I'm a big fan of Charles Bazerman. He's a genre studies scholar, and he made the claim that writing is social action in specific situations. So if we assume that he's right, what kinds of social action does writing accomplish in your specific discipline or field? And what do you think is specific about the situation that people write in your field? In philosophy, you're in, I don't know what field you'd say you're in, writing studies or language.
Yeah, both, yeah.
And then language, linguistics, yeah. So what kind of social action does writing accomplish, and what's unique about writing in your respective fields?
So both of you have mentioned co-authoring things. I had my university tenure hearing on Friday, and one of the questions that they asked me was, why haven't you co-authored anything? And I told them that that's a disciplinary thing. People who do the kind of philosophy that I do don't really tend to work collaboratively at all. I don't have a lab. I don't do experiments. I don't do interviews. I work only with texts, basically. And so in that sense, in a certain way, writing is highly non-social. It's a very solitary activity. On the one hand. On the other hand, of course, it isn't, because the texts that I'm reading are texts that other people have written, and I see myself as constantly being in conversation with them. And very often those are texts that are written by people who I meet at conferences, who work in the same field as me. And so the conversations are, of course, happening all the time. So it's sort of solitary, yet in this kind of distant conversation with others. But the other thing that I would say is, because I do specifically feminist philosophy, and so I think of the work that I do as always attempting to kind of make a mark or make an impact or interject into political or social conversations that are happening. So it's not just about interpreting text, but it's about changing the world. So that's why I said writing matters, because it's about sharing ideas and having an exchange and making things slowly but surely change. And so in that sense, my writing is deeply social, in that it's meant to make a social mark. It's meant to revolutionize something about the world in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think specific about your fields or.
Yeah, I would say, I think that for me, so I think there's a certain tension there when you think about academic writing. So on the one hand, as you were pointing to, Matthew, there's this sort of internal value, institutional value it has for us. We need to publish things. That's part of the jobs we have. So that has value for us personally. But if that's all it is, it's hard for me to imagine what the point of it is. So for me, like, I try to take on projects that I think do have some value in the world, some kind of social value. For me, that's about thinking about multilingual students, for example. How can we support these students? Thinking about pedagogy. It's also about immigrants' experiences. How can we think about the discourses of immigration in new ways that we see in the public sphere? So I think for me, it has to have some larger purpose. And this is about all writing, I think. Even your papers you're going to write in class, it should have some sort of larger intent for it to feel meaningful. On the other hand, in the case of academia, the tension there is that you often write things that are for other specialists who often may agree with you anyway. Your general orientation is toward these topics. And so I think there's ways in which, I in the future would like to look forward to doing more writing, like journalistic kind of writing, that sort of bridges the academic orientation, but also reaches people who might not read those academic journals. So those social intents move beyond just others who are already in my field.
And therefore reaches more people, because the average journal article gets read by 2.5 people or something like that. So you spend a year and a half sweating over it, and then it's your mom and 1.5 other people who reads it.
Your mom reads your journal articles? Wow, mine does not. So
there's something gratifying about the journalistic writing that that there might be thousands of people who read it. Yeah, immediately, the day after, or the same day.
Mm-hmm. So what's unique about writing in linguistics, or what kind of social action do you feel like the texts?
I mean, I think the social action is that you are entering into a conversation with those other specialists, right? I mean, I'm often thinking with particular writing pieces, who are the other people that work on this same tiny thing in my tiny corner of my world that are going to read this? Because honestly, I know not that many people beyond that are going to read it, but those people definitely will, right? So I will be thinking potentially of even particular individuals in the field that I know will be interested. And I know plenty of colleagues do things where they, if they have work that is related to somebody else's, they'll send them the paper when it's done, right? Or you talk to somebody at a conference and they'll be like, oh, that sounds super cool, send me that paper. So there's that social aspect of it. You're often contributing to a body of work that other people are also contributing to, and you'll enter into you'll be in a sort of conversation with them where some aspect of your work might be of interest to them for theirs, and so you'll send them the paper or they'll read the paper.
So, getting a little bit more specific about the things that you've written, curious what piece of writing, if you can pick one, that you've written that you're most proud of and why. And tell us what it is, where it was published, or why you wrote it if it wasn't published, etc.
Mine is whichever one happens to be most recent. It changes every time a new one comes out. I'm like, oh, that one was better than the previous ones. I feel like I get better every time. So I'm always proudest of whatever is the most recent one, because I always look back at the previous ones and go, oh man, I wish I had known that. I wish I had done that better. I wish I really could have been more concise. I mean, I think this is true for a lot of people. Looking back at actually reading pages of my dissertation is deeply painful. And I'm like, why did I put anything? Why did I do that? Every time I learn something new, so I'm always proudest of whatever the most recent one is.
So what is the most recent one, and what's it about, and where is it published? Or
I mean, I think the most recent one that came out is that one from Second Language Research, if I remember correctly, and it is about second language acquisition of the way of a particular phenomenon in Spanish about how word order, intonation, and context interact. So sentences need to have a particular word order to be appropriate in particular contexts, and we looked at whether and to what extent second language learners, kids who are English speakers learning Spanish, can acquire this thing.
So can I say two?
Yes, of course.
'Cause I'm proud of two things. So on the one hand, the book that is forthcoming, I do feel proud of because it's taken me exactly 10 years to write it. So persistence. It is my dissertation,
Wow.
which after I was done with it, I was like, vomit, I don't ever want to see this, it's going away. So I left it untouched for maybe 2 years. And then I was like, okay, this is a waste of all the time I put into it. I need to come back to it and revise it.
And it's about time itself.
And it's about
Yeah.
time, yes, it's on the topic of time. And so it's gone through millions of revisions, and I'm literally today reading the copy edits, so it's getting to the final stages. But it will feel very special to hold that book in my hand. It's long, it's a monster, and it really does reflect the last 10 years of my thinking. The other thing, which is far less formal, is that when I first found out that I was pregnant with my first child, I went and bought a diary, and I started kind of around week 10 of my pregnancy to write to her. And I just the other day went and bought an empty book to start writing to my second daughter. And I literally have 4 pages left of the book for my first daughter. So it's lasted for pretty much exactly 6 years. In early May it'll be 6 years. And it's a diary. I mean, it's definitely never going to be published. It's just for her. But I haven't written a diary since I was a kid myself. And there was something really special about writing to her, about my experience of being pregnant, about my experience of getting her out of me, and then the first years of her life. And I kind of wish my mom would have done that for me. And so that would be very special to give to her when she's like 15 or something, and say, here's the first 5 years of your life. Do with it what you want. Yeah.
Yeah, my wife tells our 7-year-old daughter the story of birth constantly. She's fascinated, but writing it down.
My daughter loves hearing it. Yes. As horrible as it was, she still loves
exactly.
it.
Like that was more than a day, you know.
I have two different reasons. One, I agree with Brad. Whatever most recent seems like is the best, and I look at the stuff before that. I know what I should have done differently. But one that I published recently, so I mentioned I have this 4-year project, which is just wrapping up the 4th year data collection, but working with a cohort of DePaul students who are international students. And I met with them when they first started their studies at DePaul, but sticking with them all through, interviewed them regularly and learning about their experiences as writers and more than that. So it's really it's great to develop these relationships with people and really learn about their lives and connect that to some of my interest as a scholar. And so I really like the piece that's coming out. I think Shelby mentioned it, or came out, sorry, in the fall, because it's my first effort to draw on that data and say something that to me highlights sort of their very human experiences and connects that to some interest in second language writing as a field. Another one that's coming out soon, I'm really happy about for now. Probably won't like it in 3 years, but that's because it's a collaboration with my former dissertation advisor. And basically, we sort of met every 2 or 3 months for about 3 years, kind of working on this thing that just came out to one article. A lot of sort of deep, meandering conversations, but somehow through all that, a lot of drafts and a lot of rewriting and a lot of sort of disagreeing, but learning how to work together. And I really appreciate that piece because I'm happy about the way it ended up, but also because I'm really cognizant of the journey we took together, of figuring each other out and figuring out how to work together and figuring out how to make all that intellectual work we were doing into something that fits into about 28 pages or so, and that I hope people will be interested in, and I think they will. So that was a cool experience to go through.
That was with Ralph Centrone?
Yeah, with Ralph Centrone, yeah.
He wrote...
Angelstown.
Yeah, a great study of literacy among like Latino men in Cicero or whatever, right?
It's the western suburbs.
Great stuff. Okay, so you kind of hinted at it then just now. So I would imagine it's different for a journal article than for a full-length manuscript. So kind of pick whatever your whatever genre, size of publication you'd like. When your goal is to publish a piece of writing, like tell us a little bit about the process of writing. Like what kinds of things do you do? How do you draft versus seek feedback, revise, that kind of stuff.
So I think this is going to mark me as ancient and very old, but I think in many ways that my process is marked by the fact that when I first started writing in school and really up until college, so through high school, computers were not the kind of thing that people actually had. I mean, computers existed when I was in high school, but nobody had a laptop or their own computer because they were super expensive and big and bulky, and so there was like the 2 computers in the school library that you could use. So that meant that writing really couldn't happen on the computer. Like the final draft, you would like go to the library and write out the final version, but everything up until that point was all like different drafts and handwriting and different notebooks and manuscripts and figuring it out. Which means that the way I started writing happened a lot sort of in notes and in my head, and by the time I sat down at the computer, I kind of wrote out a ready text. And in a way, I think that still is how I write. Like usually when I sit down on my computer, I write and it just comes out of me. But a lot of work has happened before I even sit down at the computer in terms of writing in the margins of the text that I'm reading, which for me also always involves work of translation because English is not my first language. And so when I'm engaging those English texts, I find myself translating into Swedish or rewriting what the author is saying so that I can make sense of it in my head. So the actual writing is usually fast, furious, and happens like, boom, I'm done, I'm sending it in. And then obviously things get tweaked. But whereas the revising and the thinking and the rethinking kind of happens before I even sit down.
And so are you lucky enough to literally not just have thought through things and start to write, but like you're pretty happy with the sentences as they come out, or are you trying to fix the sentences?
I usually revise very little.
Gotcha.
To be honest.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing.
I'm not necessarily advising that as the way to do it, but that's how I do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh my, I wish I could say that. To me, a lot of writing feels like pulling teeth. I like the point about, I do, like when I'm making notes or trying to figure things out, that has to happen by hand for me. But once I actually start trying to draft something, that's definitely on the computer. I'm thinking like my ideal writing situation where I can feel I can do my best work is in the morning. My kids go to school. I don't have to come to campus that day. I can sit at my computer after taking the dog for a walk, and the dog's on the couch behind me. About 8 o'clock, 8:05, I'm there. And I know I can work all the way through until about 3 p.m. My kids will come home. And if I can do that, that's like my ideal writing situation. I only take a break to eat lunch. I can be very focused. But it doesn't mean it's coming out fast and furious during that time. It's still kind of a struggle. And
maybe like doing your works cited at some point.
No, just getting a paragraph to come out is a struggle. I mean, I'm kind of have perfectionist tendencies, and that can have good sides, but it has bad sides too, because I do a lot of rewriting as I write, and I think word processing is horrible for that because it's so easy to rewrite yourself as you go, as opposed to a typewriter. We just kind of put it out and made some changes later, but it was more or less there. So I rewrite a lot as I go, for better or for worse. And sometimes I wish it didn't take me as long as I did. But then, it's just part of the process. You all work at the Writing Center, a lot of you know that, but it's part of the process and I live with it. But if I can sit down and focus for about 7 hours straight, that's good.
I never focus for 7 hours straight. I can work on an actual writing. I can work for about 2 hours before I'm tired and I want to do something else. Sometimes I can write for 4 hours in a day if it's 2 different projects. But I often find that 2 hours is about the sweet spot. So I try to do that in the morning. I usually block out 10 to 12 every day for that. And most days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at least during the school year, often more than that during breaks, I meet with 2 colleagues at a coffee shop and sit there on my laptop and write and put in my headphones, and we don't talk to each other, and we just sit there and write. And so there's some sort of accountability there. I've discovered I'm very convinced by the research that shows that people are like are liquids basically, in that we adapt to the container into which we're put. So you sort of take the shape of whatever container you're put in. So if you create a system, systems beat willpower every time. So the fact that there are people who are waiting for me there, it makes me actually show up, and that's writing that I wouldn't get done otherwise. So I have to sort of build those systems for myself. So that's sort of usually 10 to 12. If I'm not meeting with them, I generally come to my office so that is sort of aside from, separate from home. I try to keep the email program closed during that whole time. I close my door. I tell people I'm not available. Like I tell them I have a meeting, and so I can't meet then. And that's how I sort of spread that out. So I can't do big chunks of time, so I try to do a little time every day. With regard to the actual drafting process, I outline. I try often to do a progressively more detailed outline, sort of building from the outline right into the text. Often the outline will have sentences as the headers. I write the methods section first, as does everyone that I know that writes the kind of articles that I do, because that part is usually fresh because you just did the experiment and is really concrete. I write the introduction last usually, and the abstract very last. I do sort of draft. I often do the, I don't remember who coined this term. Somebody who writes about writing coined the term shitty first draft.
Oh, yeah.
Annie Lamont. Okay, yeah. So I generally adopt that. Like, if today is a day that I'm drafting, I'm just drafting, and I'm gonna put all my thoughts down on the paper here, on the virtual paper, and then come back and organize it and make things nicer. So I do definitely do like a draft and revise phase. If I'm working collaboratively, that's a huge bonus for me because that builds in, accountability, builds in a system. There's a deadline that matters, right? It's not just a deadline to myself. If I don't meet it, I'll feel sad. It's if I don't meet it, somebody's like waiting to work on this. But also, it builds in that revise phase because I can do a first draft and send it to them, and that feedback cycle is sort of built in.
So back to what you said earlier, you just did the method, so you can write that section up. But it's possible you're starting a piece, you write the methods, but whatever the exact name of the section is, whether it's discussion section, that might be more writing for discovery. Like you may not know exactly what you think yet, or you may be like, oh, I'm open to new stuff. Let me write about it. And like, oh my God, that is true. Or I thought it was this, but I wrote about it for 10 minutes and I don't agree at all.
Yes, absolutely. And there are like discarded like discussion sections in like the graveyard of my computer, like of implications we thought this study might have that it doesn't, or that just we can't make that point work. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. So on that note about the social nature of writing, I don't know if the colleagues at the coffee shop sound like they're mainly there for social accountability. So whether it's co-authors or whether it's advisors we've mentioned, what's the most important or meaningful writing feedback you've ever received? So it could be a particular person or a particular, piece of feedback on some writing. And who gave it? What was it?
So what happens when you publish in academia, if you don't know, is that you submit your article or your book or whatever it is for review, and then usually 2 or sometimes 3 anonymous readers read it without knowing who you are. They blind review it, and then they give you feedback. And receiving that feedback back can be traumatizing and anxiety-provoking. Usually it's like, reader number 2, just this is it, and you feel really awful about yourself. And so it's a mixed bag. But I think, when I finally, after all these years of working on the book, finally sent it off, and I got 2 reviews of it, and one of them, kind of almost made me cry from feeling grateful that somebody had just spent so much time on reading my work. And it was like a 450-page manuscript, and there was comments on every single page, and all of the comments were generous and helpful and made the book much better, and were really in the interest of making it better rather than dismissing or And so I still don't really know who that person was. If I ever find out, I'll give them a big hug. But they put a lot of work into my book, and it felt amazing to be seen and read in that kind of way by somebody who I didn't even know who it was, who may never get a thank you for it, but who really spent many, many hours making my book so much better. So I think that for me was the most kind of
that's
amazing.
Do you have any sense of, can you recall, like, whether it's a particular kind of comment, like how did the reviewer make you feel like they were on your side, that, you know, they were supportive? Like, literally, what did the comments say? Do you remember?
Well, first of all, the reviewer was very clear that the book was great and that it should be published, and that none of the comments were meant to say that this wasn't good work, but that, like, this was publishable as is, and whatever comments were just there to help the author improve it. But then I think, I mean, the best kinds of comments, and I remember this also with my dissertation advisor, that sometimes I would go to his office and, you know, he had read a draft of a chapter and I felt nervous. And he would begin by kind of telling me what I had done. And oftentimes I didn't know myself what I had done or what I had said because I was so in the thick of it. And so having somebody summarize to you what the central claims and stakes of what you just did is, in a way that actually makes you understand what you did, and again, it makes you feel seen and read, like, oh my God, somebody actually, like, understood what I did, and they understood it better than me, despite all the time I put into it, and they put it in much better terms than me. That's very, very helpful and gratifying, both at once. And then, of course, it's the critical questions, like people pushing you or asking, like, what about this? Or I take this claim to be limited or problematic for these reasons, such that you can go back to it and be like, oh, I didn't think of that, but there's more that could be done here. Or here's how my claim could be read in a way that steps on toes, or, you know, that sort of shows my own privileged position in a way that I need to be more aware of or something. I mean, all of that is amazing. Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to read Elephant and Piggy at all, the kids' books? Well, anyway, in this room, I don't know if you all remember the peer tutors who are here.
I read only kids' books in Swedish.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So
yeah, this is definitely written by a dude from New York. Anyway, every year for the new tutors, I give a talk about the very thing you just said, just that sometimes the fact that a peer tutor is a reader and taking the time to carefully read something someone wrote is a generous act, and an act that makes writers feel validated. And, like, because a lot of times your instructor is your only reader, so a peer tutor makes the readers, like, double at the very least. So, and it's just it can be a beautiful thing when, you know, somebody shows you how much care they took to read your work and to be on your side and try to understand where you're coming from and give you the benefit of the doubt, and then also create a little bit of space to then be critical, to push back and to push the ideas. Yeah. What's a piece of feedback or a feedback story that was really meaningful for you all?
I would go with the example of the of getting reviews, anonymous reviews on your submissions of academic papers. It's absolutely traumatic. It's horrible. Sort of at the end of my PhD and right after I got out of it, it took me a few years to understand that process, because you submit a paper and the review always restarts something like, this is an important contribution, we need to be talking about these issues, and then however lasts about 2 pages or something. And it often leads to, therefore, I don't feel like this should be accepted for publication. But what I learned from that is going through at least a handful of those and getting papers rejected in those terms. I mean, a good thing about getting papers rejected in academia is you do get feedback. Whereas if you submit like literary works, you don't get any feedback. No thanks, no thanks, no thanks. You don't really know why. So that's a good thing. And what I learned from those experiences was something I should have known from studying rhetoric, but I really have to think more about audience. I have to really think about who are the potential readers of this. What do they already know? What do they maybe not know? How is whatever I've done or think I know fit into the way they think about things, their knowledge base? And so I really learned from that process, because I think part of what I was doing then is not framing what I wanted to do for the audience in the way it needed to be framed, or not sort of speaking to the knowledge they already had, or maybe assuming they didn't have the knowledge they already had and sort of explaining too much. So through that process, I really got a lot better of thinking about who my audience would be and therefore how exactly I'd want to frame this, what I need to include, what not to include, and how can I bring in something that feels like an intervention, an interesting contribution to that specific audience. And that led me to also, as I got further along with it, as I do now, really think about, okay, what's a specific journal where I really think this might fit? Because I really, that became the way I had to start thinking to understand how what I was writing would be meaningful and hopefully accepted by people who thought that was interesting, yeah.
So it sounds like you got feedback and then thought about the perspective of that feedback, and then were able to sort of apply that feedback to kind of become that almost imagined reader for yourself.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
How about yourself? With some great feedback?
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add, honestly. I think I also have found feedback from anonymous reviewers to be very helpful, even when it is very painful. I think I can't, there's not one instance that stands out, though.
Okay, so taking a step back then, and we have a little bit of time left, but for our audience here, interested in some kind of advice. So if you could tell your college-aged self something that when you look back you didn't understand about writing, but that you feel like you understand about writing now, what advice might that be? And then my assumption here is there are some people here in college who could maybe benefit from that. So I don't know if there's a specific thing that you thought about writing in a way that was problematic back then, but
I mean, I already said mine, actually. It came up earlier, but mine is that systems trump willpower. That was the thing that it took me a long time to learn, that putting a system in place is way better than having good intentions and really like wanting to do this project. You have to build a structure that makes it so that the path of least resistance is to do the project. And I found that was the most effective thing that I learned about writing, like setting up a schedule and putting some sort of accountability system in place so that you stick to that schedule. I'm writing, making a little bit of progress every day is much more effective than just really wanting to do it and getting really stressed out about it and then waiting until the last minute and then exploding all your words all over the page and then throwing it at your professor's door and running away. Like that is not the most effective way to approach things, and I approached things a lot like that in college. So that's something I would go back and say.
And the system that really works for you is the time-based get together with other people who are writing and commit to like, we're going to write for this time. And we're not even necessarily going to talk to each other. You mentioned like you put in your earbuds and it's just, we're here together, we're going to do this, and you show up and... That's
one of the systems. Yeah. I'm a big believer in systems, so I have a lot of systems actually. There's more to it than that, but there's a lot of like pre-planning and keeping track of things and building an accountability. I also started a group of faculty peers who started the same year as me, who just exist to have accountability. Like, this is what I'm going to write for the next 2 weeks, and then we meet again 2 weeks. Did you write that thing? Right. So I think that there's a lot of like, I'm a big believer in systems, like I said, and I mean the evidence on faculty writing is completely clear, right? That people who have repeated low-stakes interaction with a project that they enjoy, like that is to say they write a little bit every day, are more productive than people who don't. Like that's just what the data shows, right? So I took that to heart and tried to make that into a habit.
Sounds good. Anything that y'all thought of?
Yes, I mean, the piece of advice that I wish I would have gotten is very pragmatic and straightforward. It's back up your work.
No.
I mean, I had the experience as I was in the process of applying for grad school, and applications were due January 1st, and I applied in the US, and so I had written all my materials in English, which was really hard for me. And so my writing sample I had really been sweating over to basically translate something that I had in Swedish into English for the first time in my life. And so I put a lot of work into it, and I was traveling over Christmas, and I had my laptop with me. And I had checked my bags, and I had a little hand luggage, and the woman at the check-in said, we're not fully booked today, so if you want to, you can check in the hand luggage too. And I was like, great, sweet, I can go without a bag. So I checked it in without thinking about the fact that my laptop was in it, and it was stolen. And that was the only place that I had my writing sample in English that was due a week later. Where actually I had backed it up in one place on floppy disks, which is what we had back then, but they were in the bag that was stolen. And so I had to basically on Christmas Eve try to get hold of because I was like, I can't do this again. So I had to get hold of a translator who would translate my work in 1 week between Christmas and New Year's. And it worked out and it was fine. But I think since then, backing up in multiple locations, I mean, obviously you're not using floppy disks these days, good for you. But, you know, having Dropbox and emailing things to yourselves and having them on a cloud so that if one thing crashes, there's always, you know, and I get this from students a fair amount too, you know, the day before the deadline, my computer crashed or this or that. It's like, well, why didn't you back it up? So I think that would be my piece of advice. I mean, I had the privilege as a college student in terms of my writing that I think I had access to undisturbed time in a way that you probably don't. I know I don't anymore. I didn't own a cell phone. Internet was the kind of thing that only was in the library with a cable. And so I think now the advice that I would need if I was a college student today was figuring out mechanisms to find not just structured time but undisturbed time. I mean, I find myself now, even though I did not grow up using these devices, I can write for about 7 minutes and then I'm checking Facebook, and then I write for another 6 minutes and then I'm checking Instagram, and it's like the constant interruption. So whatever way you can find to work around that, I think will be helpful, because it's not helpful for your writing. It's not helpful for mine, that I know.
I might say a couple things that may be related. One is when you're writing now, you should just take all the risks you want and experiment and do all these things that you want to try with writing. Thinking back on myself when I was in college, it seems weird now, especially those of you who've had my classes. Like when I want you to write a paper, I expect you to do a certain kind of paper, and that's what I'm looking for. And if you don't write that paper, I might not be happy about it, or it will be reflected in the grade. And when I was in college, I get assignments sometimes. Assignments I got were not like the ones I give. They were much, more, they were vaguer. But I would just sort of write whatever paper I wanted. And I remember once in this class I had about the postmodern novel, I wrote a paper that was kind of like a postmodern novel. And it was like, if we're going to talk about these things and take them seriously, I can write a paper like this too. The professor was not impressed. But I think in retrospect, like that's what you should do. Because the thing is, when you get older, if you start writing more and you write in any kind of professional way, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in scholarly work, whether it's in any kind of writing in the world, which writing is everywhere, the stakes get a lot higher. And there are expectations, whether it's because if you don't write this way, you won't get a paper accepted, which will affect your job, or all these kinds of different things, the stakes go up. Even when you're writing a statement to get into graduate school later, the stakes are up. So I know they feel like they're up now because they're writing papers for classes, you're getting grades, and that matters. But really, the stakes are low, and I encourage you just to be wild. And if it pisses your professor off, that's fine, and just go. And I'd go talk to the professor, and say, "Why'd you give me this grade? We're reading this. I mean, what's going on here?" That's what I did, and I encourage you kind of just to go for it for now, because it gets harder in life to go for it, especially if the pressure's on to conform. And whether you want to get a grant, you got to write it a certain way, and you want to get that grant. So keep that in mind. One other thing is that I kind of did creative writing for many years when I was younger, and I was very kind of private about my writing. I'm kind of a private person, so that came out in the way I treated my writing too. I don't know if that's necessarily bad. There are good things about that too, because you get to sort of hone what you're doing in a private way. But if you're like that, I would encourage you just to try to be more willing to share as you can, because that's what happens again if you keep writing more. People are going to read your stuff. People are going to give you feedback, and you all work in the Writing Center. A lot of you know that. But if you're inclined to sort of keep it private too, push yourself to open up a little bit, as much as you can anyway.
Awesome. So my last question for you, and then we're going to give the audience a chance to ask any questions, is what are you working on now?
I'm working on, so the actual writing thing that I did today was I'm working on a paper that is an extension of that same project about second language learning, but with new measures and methods. So we measured real-time reading times to see sort of how people process this particular linguistic structure in real time, so we can measure as people are reading a sentence how long it takes them to read a sentence, and then manipulate the sentence and see how that changes the reading times. So we're essentially writing up that paper now, and I'm building a new experiment which we're going to deploy this quarter. That is about language mixing. So when you use Spanish and English in the same sentence, what are the syntactic restrictions on how that works?
I'm just thinking of my 4-year project again with international student undergraduate writers, going through those transcripts and that data. I've really been interested to look at what kinds of strategies the students are using that I've heard from them over the years. So it kind of relates to what you do in the Writing Center. So for example, coming to the Writing Center is one strategy, and trying to think about the different strategies they use, either as what I'm calling like survival strategies, because the paper's due the next day and they got to get it done and they need something to help them, or what I'm thinking about is growth strategies. So really trying to actually learn something to become better writers. And I think, for example, my conversations with students suggest that the Writing Center can be both. Sometimes, I think students come because they just got to get that paper done and they want it to be better. But sometimes they come, and they come regularly because they really want to learn things to make them better writers. So I'm really interested in digging deep into that data and figuring out what are their strategies and how can I understand why they do what they do and what are the results of that.
So I am frantically trying to wrap up all of my ongoing projects because I'm giving birth this summer, and I know after that, who knows when I'll find time to write again. And so just in this week, I've gone through page proofs of 2 different articles, one on motherhood in Kristeva, the other on the coloniality of time and a critical analysis of Judith Butler's work. And then I'm going through the copy edits of my book. So right now I'm not writing as much as like copy editing, looking at page proofs, finding an indexer, doing all of this sort of nitty-gritty stuff to get things off my desk before I give birth.
So, do y'all have questions for our panelists? Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Sorry about that.
Hi, my question is for Fanny. So I was wondering if you have any advice for someone who would want to go into a career that like heavily involves writing in a different country, and like what kind of just advice you would have for like getting started on that, or tips.
In a different country, in a different language also, or yeah.
Yeah, either way, yes or no.
So, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so the language thing, it's obviously its own can of worms. And I think for me, as somebody who had taken a lot of pride in my writing as a journalist, I knew that I was good at writing. And I had published a lot, and then I, started grad school, and I had to really grapple with the fact that, like, I was a lousy writer because I was writing in a foreign language. And so that took a lot of mental work in terms of, like, learning a foreign language always does, but, like, when it's suddenly high stake and you're in graduate classes, or if you're trying to publish or professionally do something, to I think, on the one hand, really give yourself some slack in the beginning, that like it's going to be hard to write in a language that's not yours, and it by definition sort of limits your capacity to say things exactly the way you want to say them or get the right nuance out of it. So don't be too hard on yourself in the beginning. And in that phase, if you are suddenly writing in a language that's not yours, really, really take advantage of other people to help you. Don't be shy to use and abuse your friends to read your work and to give you feedback, and have people who can copy edit your work and help you, and find ways in which you can help them in some other way so that you don't have to feel too guilty about it. But like, you're not going to be able to do it on your own in the beginning. You're going to need a good support system. So that's one thing. And then beyond the language, it's also learning a different culture of what constitutes good writing or what's expected. Academic writing in Sweden is not quite the same as academic writing here. I've never done journalistic writing in English, and I would feel super nervous to do it for those very reasons. I don't have a context that I can lean on. And so, again, being kind to yourself in the process of navigating that, and getting from a point where you might feel like you're really good at something to suddenly feeling like you're 5 years old again and you have to relearn. That's hard. So being kind to yourself, but also then feeling really proud about having done it if you do it, because that's great. Yeah.
Thank you guys all for coming, by the way. I have like so many questions that I wrote down, but my number one question was, you mentioned Bonnie, right? You mentioned something about like in the beginning about how you email people and other faculty and stuff, and my coworkers will know that I love emailing, so I'm just wondering, like, how do you view informal writing, like whether it's emailing, texting, or whatever, and do you think like, do you think it's important to consider how we use writing informally as well as formally? And like, how do you view that, I guess?
For any review, want to start?
I think that is a place that's something that's super important now, right? Because people are writing more than they ever have ever before, right? In the history of the world, right? There's an amazing, I don't know if you're familiar with the comic XKCD, but he has this delightful comic where he likens it to a generation of kids who grow up every single day, every single hour of every single day, they are throwing a ball in the air, and then, you know, people are complaining that they can't play baseball because they don't have good form, right? And he's like, are you seriously claiming that these kids that have thrown a ball every single day for their entire lives are worse baseball players because they don't have this specific form? That's bonkers. And I think so I think it's super important to know that there are different contexts to writing, and that there is such a thing as informal writing, because a lot of people think that there's only formal writing, there's one right way to do it, but there's not, right? And we all know there's not. So I think it's important to recognize that, and I think that it's an incredibly important genre that's really sort of understood, that's not well understood, right? It has its own conventions. There's a book coming out, actually, a popular book, not a scholarly book, by a linguist named Gretchen McCulloch, who's delightful, it's called Because Internet, and it's internet linguistics, and she like breaks down all these things about like why it's rude to end, like why ending a text with a period sort of sounds harsh, why like how you can use punctuation to add intonation into written text. That's what the book is about. So if you're interested in informal writing, you might want to check it out. But I think it's super important because it's something we do it constantly.
So it's funny. I think you know, we tend to think of the ways in which informal writing affects our formal writing, but maybe not so often the other way around. And so again, for somebody like me who was not texting when I first started writing, I think in a way it happens much more the other way around, in a way that embarrasses me. And so, for example, I cannot write a text message that doesn't have a period at the end, and where each sentence doesn't start with capital letter. And I literally will have to go back and correct, because it's so ingrained in me that like I have to write incomplete sentences. But that really disables me in terms of being an effective texter, or because like it takes me forever to write a text, because I treat it as a journal article.
Yeah, well, and you come off as like
so I have a lot to learn from you about how to like skip the periods and.
I've thought about this a lot. I am bad at texting. I'm bad at it, and I come off as rude to people. I'm sure of it without intending to, because I haven't mastered these things that are specific to this genre, to this informal writing style. And so I'm totally there with you, because I do the same thing with text messages.
Okay, so in that same vein, I heard talk about, like, in terms of y'all's writing process, that you mostly did not grow up with, like, the internet or with writing on word processor, which all of us do. I would say that, like, far and away the bulk of my academic writing is very much, like, starts and ends on a computer. And what do you think are potentially like the implications of that, or like as professors who have extensive experience with students writing that was probably also mostly done on a word processor, what do you think we are maybe learning to do differently, or what do you think is potentially like becoming stronger or becoming weaker about writing overall, now that it is much more of like a digital process where you can like really edit as you go, and it's not as much about like the written work?
That's a great question.
I would say one thing in general about, I mentioned earlier that I think word processing is great and so wonderful, but I think it's horrible because you just for me anyway, I'm constantly revising myself. And it can seem good because you're getting something that's better, but in that process, like you're stuck on 2 paragraphs instead of moving on to page 2, I wish I could use a shitty first draft kind of approach. I think that's great. I don't know how it's working for students, but I'll say for me, one thing I don't get from word processor, I do get from working on paper, So maybe some of you are missing this, I don't know, is a sense of space. I can't get a sense of space with the screen, so I can go from page 1 to page 2, from page to page 7, but that's nothing like sort of putting 4 pages out in front of me and trying to figure out how it fits together, and this connects to that. And so so you can print out your draft and work in that way. I would advise that. But I really regret not having space on the screen, and I always print things out to revise them and think about them more when I'm getting closer to what feels like a full draft.
Yeah, so I would say, so I hear you about the kind of copy-pasting or revising or redrafting can be a curse, but I also think that it is kind of an amazing opportunity that you have that I never had, that things don't have to be so final from the start, but that you can have multiple documents and work with different versions and then kind of merge them together and finalize things. So I think that's something that has gotten better for you. I would really, really agree with this idea that the spatiality of writing matters a lot, and there's something about a screen that is really not conducive neither to writing nor to reading. And so I typically advise my students, so those of you who've taken class with me, you know this, that I never want you to do the reading on a computer screen, but print it out and use a pen and mess with the text. And the same is true for your own text. So I typically, for example, advise my students, and I do this myself all the time, to print out whatever you've written and to read it out loud. Because when you hear what you've written, suddenly you hear everything that's awkward that was invisible on the screen. And so, for example, I think many of you make a lot of spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes that my generation did much less of, because we really had to learn. We didn't have spell check programs. We didn't have any shortcuts, but we had to kind of really know how it worked. And so as much as it's amazing that those spell check programs exist, like actually reading your text out and not just trusting that the computer is going to fix it for you, but listening to your words and listening to whether they make sense, whether it sounds smooth, those are things that I would really recommend, to step away from the computer a little bit, as much as it is a very helpful tool, but also to step away from it. Having the paper in front of you, hearing the text, also doing some of the revisions with the pen. So when I got my whole book sent to me last week, the first thing I did was to print the manuscript. I am absolutely not reading it on the screen. I put it in a binder, I'm going through page by page with the pen, and then I'll go back to the screen and make the changes. But half of it I wouldn't see on the screen because it blinds you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than I do most of my drafting on the computer. I don't actually do a lot on paper. I think the only, and I see a lot of the advantages that Fanny mentioned to doing that. I think there's a lot of ways that it's more effective, and I think some of the fundamental problems are the same. The big thing about the computer that strikes me is the thing that Fanny mentioned earlier, which is that there are so many distractions that are right there in the computer. Or that are outside the document. So it's not about the word processing necessarily. It's about the alt tab to whatever, Facebook or Twitter or whatever. That seems like the bigger problem to me, but I don't know.
Notifications.
Yeah, notifications, right? Having your email program open in the background so that it can pop up and distract you with the notification. That I think is sort of killer.
So my question is about feedback, and do you think your experiences, like as being a published writer and like getting that professional feedback, has positively influenced your feedback giving process, like to your students, and like maybe like what that influence is, and like if getting feedback helps you give feedback and that sort of thing? So.
I think it's definitely made me more conscious of the way that feedback feels. I mean, I knew that. I've been a student, right? And I remember getting a paper, marked all over with red that was that maybe hurt my feelings, but like it's more so even when you've spent a long time on a journal article and you have this feedback that takes your argument apart and how everything that you thought is stupid and your experiment doesn't work. It's given me a sense of like how to be sensitive to that fact that. This person probably didn't mean to be. They weren't trying to be cruel necessarily. They were just stating factual things about your paper, but it can come off that way. And I learned from reading reviewers. I got good models of ways to say, I think what Jason said before, where they'll start with, this makes an important contribution, and like most people are decent about it, and so they will frame the feedback in a way that doesn't tear it down and make you feel like you're worthless. They'll say, it has a lot of problems and I don't think it should be published, but here's why, and it has these good points. And so I'm a little more conscious of doing that with my students, of saying, good job with, like, I see what you're going for here, but let's address the issues, rather than, without meaning to be cruel, just going, nope, bad idea, At least I try, I don't know. People previous students can tell me if I succeed, but.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, I think that the two things that I've learned that pisses me off in terms of feedback that I've gotten is, on the one hand, the reviewer who will not say something good about what I did. And so I've kind of made it a rule of thumb for myself when I read student papers that I will identify at the very least one thing that was great about this paper, even though it might have limitations. The other thing that pisses me off is when you kind of get almost no feedback. It's like, this is all good. That really pisses me off, because of course it isn't. And there's always more that can be done. And so I think what I've learned from receiving feedback is to always make sure to say something good to the student who wrote the paper, but to also make sure to say a fair amount of stuff about it, not just like, great job, A. I mean, that seems to me like a slap in the face almost. Like, I put in enough work that I wrote in a paper. Give me something back, please, I think one of the things that I have learned a ton from, and that's why I do a lot of peer reviewing in my classes, is precisely, I mean, I've learned a lot about my own writing by giving feedback. And so I worked all my time in grad school as a editor at the journal that was coming out of my university, which was a peer-reviewed professional academic journal. Communicating endlessly with authors about their texts. And that experience made me a way, way better writer. Because it's easy to see the problems with somebody else's writing. It's really hard to see your own blind spots. And so the practice of critically reading other people's paper, so for all of those of you who work in the writing center, you're going to be amazing writers because of it, for sure. Yeah.
I might just add that I don't know how going through this sort of rigorous review process has affected the way I give feedback to students. I definitely view strongly that I always try to start with something positive. There's something good to say about every single paper I've ever seen, but then I also have that moment, however, and then I go into that. I sometimes actually feel bad about the way the whole academic discourse works is about criticism. Sort of zeroing in on, that's what this whole review process about is journals, zeroing in on, here are the problems. In the good version, it's sort of, here are the problems, and you can work on these and they can get better. The bad version is, here are the problems, why did you do this? Sort of like, whatever you thought you did is crap, it's stupid. And I think sometimes, honestly, we as instructors, kind of internalize that and put it back on students, for better or for worse. And the good side is, the effort is to be critical in a way that will help you get better. I mean, I think all of you want criticism, you want to hear what's good, but you want to hear what could be better. But sometimes I feel like we focus too much on what could be better and not enough on what's good, even though I do start with what's good. That's part of the whole structure of the institution about grades and all these things. I'm saying this knowing some of you, I put comments on some of your papers and you're like, what's he talking about? But I guess what I'm saying is I have to push back at my own critical tendencies sometimes, which are unfortunately reinforced or encouraged by this discourse of academia.
So I really liked what you said about how screens are kind of a limitation to that sense of space that writing can provide. And I loved your comments about outlining and how you often develop like a progressive outline. That's something that I find myself always suggesting to writers who are stuck. But that's kind of what this question is. It's more like a writing process question. I find that I start with an outline in order for me to overcome the limitation that, maybe a full paper might have with space and figuring out where I am in the paper. So I kind of use the outline as a map of sorts. But then I find that it doesn't work, and so I go back to paper because I can see it all in front of me. This is a really roundabout way of me asking, like, what do you do when you're stuck or when you can't generate ideas? Because I found that I often go to paper to do that. But.
I eat chocolate. That usually helps. Seriously.
No joke, I do the same thing. I go and make an espresso, and I drink that, and have some chocolate too if I got some in the house. And then either it helps me sort of feel better, or it's just like, no, I can't do this today, whatever. And just, you got to know when to say, I mean, I know when you're under time pressure, you got papers to turn in. It's different, and we have time pressure too. But ideally, you should start your work, as I tell students, and I sometimes structure the classes so they have to start working on their papers earlier than a lot of them would, because you need that time to be able to say, you know what, I don't really know what this means right now, and I don't know what to do about it, and I just need to not look at it for 2 days. Sometimes that's the best thing to do. And then you come back and hopefully you've got some new way of thinking about it, or you just open the page and you're like, okay, that sentence is no good and that's where I got messed up, and if I take that out and put in a different one, it's going to open a new door to me, and that's going to do it. So I think but it's about planning, giving yourself enough time before your due date to give yourself space to not be able to write sometimes, and to make mistakes, and to figure out how to make them better. But chocolate is really the ideal thing.
I would imagine too that sometimes it's about you identify you need to go back and analyze the data more, or you need to read more, or something. That you realize like it's not just a inspiration wall, but it's literally like a knowledge or understanding of the data wall.
Yeah, I have a couple strategies when not being able to not being able to generate ideas. One is definitely to step away for a little while, to just, if you still want to work on the paper, work on a different section if you're stuck on one particular section, or just walk away from that completely and do a different project. So I try to have a couple different projects going on. A couple other tools that I use are, I will say, all right, I'm not writing anything on this paper, but I am writing today, so I'm going to sit down and I'm going to spend, sometimes I'll use the Pomodoro method where you do 25 minutes and then a 5-minute break, set a timer, and it's just free writing. It's literally, I'm going to write whatever comes into my head about this topic, and it's just going to be babble, but it's going to hopefully maybe get my ideas a little bit more structured. On the same thing, I might make a to-do list of like, this is what I would need to do to address this problem. I'm not going to do any of this stuff today because I'm burned out, but this is what I'm going to need to do. So this is my list for when I come in tomorrow. But I think the most effective of these is to build in some kind of accountability. So what is ideal is if you have a friend or a colleague or somebody who understands your work well enough, set up a presentation to them in a couple days or a week's time, so that you have that coming up, and you're like, I'm going to sit down and explain to you my idea, and I'm going to write a little thing like a handout for you to explain this idea, and then you find that all of a sudden your thinking has to crystallize because you have to explain this to somebody else. So that's where collaborators on the project can be really, really helpful, because then that's built in. And so I'll schedule a meeting with my collaborators and I'll say, we need to figure out this problem. But often it's not the meeting, it's the preparation for the meeting that's the most helpful part, because my thinking is a lot clearer by the time that meeting rolls around, because I have to sit down and work it out. So that's one of the ways that I sort of build in accountability.
So I guess this can be for everybody, but I was really interested in what you were saying about systems versus like personal motivations, since that's something that I definitely think is really helpful. So I was just wondering, I guess with you guys as well as you, what other systems do you use to keep yourself accountable for writing, or keep yourself motivated for writing, kind of like you were mentioning earlier?
Mm-hmm. I've done a couple things to track the amount of writing that I've done. It depends on the project, right? So I made a spreadsheet, because of course I did, of the thing I was working on and the number of words that I wrote each day, and the amount of time that I wrote each day, and kept track of it. And I set a goal of writing for half an hour every day at first, and then gradually upped that goal. And then I would give myself a reward for every streak that I hit. So this is sometimes called the don't break the chain method, where you have, what you're trying to do is just get consecutive streaks of some relatively attainable goal. I actually had for a long time in my office a printed out calendar that was designed just for this, so it had all the days of the entire year listed in just 2 columns of numbers, and every day I would circle if I had done my writing for that day, and the goal was to get the longest chain possible, and I would give myself little treats, as I got progressively higher numbers of streaks. Weekends I would take off, but other than that, the idea was every weekday I had to write, and this was the streak. So that's the the don't break the chain method I've used. Now I've actually gotten an app that does the same thing, basically, that like every day I'm like, did I write for an hour today? Yes or no? And I like have a little tracker of that, and then I can see how often I do that.
Recommend that app?
It's, no, I don't know. It's Habit something. I don't know. There's a bunch of them. There's like there's a bunch of ones like that. But also like honestly, the app is pretty new. The piece of paper with the days on it where I actually circled the day was probably as good as the app, at least. What other? I'm sure there are other systems that I have, but what do y'all do? Yeah, so sometimes I've used the Pomodoro method where, you set out to do a certain number of Pomodoros, which is so-called because the writer who invented it had a timer that looked like a tomato, and Pomodoro is the Italian word for tomato. He would set the timer for 25 minutes, and then when it was done, he would get up and walk away for 5 minutes, and then do another Pomodoro for 25 minutes. And you can set some number of Pomodoros as a goal. So I'm going to do 2 Pomodoros today. And the nice thing about that is it has breaks built in. So another system for when I get stuck is I will do a thing where it's where if you like really, really have a lot of resistance to writing that day, I will say that's fine. I don't even have to do a full Pomodoro. I am going to write for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever you think you can do. And you usually find that by the time you actually get to the end of the 10 minutes, you've got more to say. But that's not like a consistency system. That's a resistance thing. That's a different thing than what you asked.
And Kate, there's a Slack bot you can add to Slack for Pomodoro timing. You can just slash Pomodoro, and then it'll set one up for you if you want.
So I am nowhere near as sophisticated about structuring my writing as you are, that's clear. For me, this whole thing about writing for an hour or 2 every day or for 10 minutes would never work. That's not how so everybody is also different in terms of their writing. As I said, I'm somebody, I'll think, I'll read, I'll ponder, I'll think, I'll read, I'll ponder, and then I need absolutely the 7 hours or 9 hours. Which means I know already, any day that I teach, any day that I have meetings, writing will not happen because I can't squeeze writing in 2 hours in between. So I need to set these stretches of time. And so for me, it has to do with literally planning my teaching such that, in some quarters I teach a lot, and then in some quarters I have less teaching so that I can really have teaching-free days to write. The only thing that works for me is deadlines. And so as a journalist, that was sweet because my deadlines were every 3 days, and it was at 9 a.m. and if it came out at 9:05, it would be delayed because that's when it went to the press. Whereas with academic writing, that's been challenging because rarely does anyone impose a deadline on me. I just wrote a book that took me 10 years, so you can imagine the kind of deadline involved in that. And so, for example, for writing the dissertation, which was a big enough project where nobody held me accountable. My advisor was like, come to me when you're done, there are no deadlines. I knew that wasn't going to work for me. And so I basically had to use something like conferences as a way to impose deadlines. Chapter 1, I'm going to submit to this conference, and on that day, I'm going to have to present it. So it gives me a deadline. Chapter 2, I'm submitting to this conference. And so I have to create a time management system that builds deadlines into only under pressure will I get writing done. I'm a procrastinator until the point when it's I got to get this done. So when deadlines are not imposed on you, you have to figure out ways of kind of artificially creating them. Yeah.
And that's what my accountability group that I set up did, was to sort of have an external, because I can impose all the deadlines I want on myself. And
no, they have to be externalized.
Yeah, they have to be external,
otherwise
right?
They're not real.
So that was a way to sort of artificially put some pressure, is to have somebody you're going to report to. I said I was going to do this, did I do it, right?
I have to confess, I think I have no systems for writing. I've never thought about it before, really. Nothing like Brad has, for sure. Which I advise strongly. You should listen to what he said. I think I just, I'm very disciplined, like I said. It's no problem for me to sit down and focus. I can do that, but and I like to do that. But I think I must have some, it has to be some kind of existential anxiety that somehow, I have this thing and I want it to become a piece of writing and I'm excited about it and there's something there. But I have no idea how I'm going to get from here to the end product. So somehow it's some kind of anxiety. I've got to do it. Somehow it's got to happen, and that maybe kind of drives me to keep working. And some days, or a period of days, I'm working on something that's not going well. I just feel bad. Then other days or periods, it'll go well, and I feel good. I feel more relaxed. I'm like, yeah, life's pretty good. Yeah. And there's a lot of other things in life too, of course. But I will follow up on Fanny's point we talked about earlier. I have a baby soon. I mean, when there's a lot of activity in the house and you've got work, and we talked earlier about writing and all the emails and all the stuff that's related to our work besides writing or besides writing scholarship, yeah, you got certain blocks and you got to do it. Like, that's your block, you're going to make it happen in that block somehow, and whatever. And it's just, yeah, I don't recommend the anxiety, by the way.
Chaos creates discipline.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it, yeah.
And two more quick notes. The thing that I already mentioned of having a writing buddy, that's been like the single most effective thing that I've done. So like the keeping track of the don't break the chain thing is useful, but the single most effective thing that I've done is have a writing buddy that is going to expect you to be there on a particular day where we're going to sit down 3 times a week and spend 2 hours typing. It's because people are fundamentally social, right? Fundamentally social animals. And so that kind of social pressure is so much better than any kind of like scolding yourself or anything else that you can do. So building that was probably the most effective thing that I did. Another thing that on this topic that I wanted to mention is I really like the book it's a small book by Paul J. Silva called How to Write a Lot. And it's nothing, I've already told you everything that's in the book, which is basically mark off 2 hours every day, sit down and make those a commitment. That's the whole book. But he goes over it in a slightly more detail, and it's also pretty brief and approachable, so I would recommend that.
And chocolate.
Yes, exactly. Excellent. So, you guys, let's give our panelists a round of applause, please. Let's also give a serious shout out to Shelby. Thanks so much to Aaron and Jen for all the work planning the event. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. For the panelists, thank you so much. I mean, I'm a little emotional. This went so well. This is amazing. Writing totally matters, and you guys really gave us a lot of really great ideas and concrete ways in which it does. And I really appreciate your time and appreciate everyone else coming out. So thanks so much. And